Hello, my name is Karen Hughes, and I am the Domestic Violence Clinical Services Coordinator for the Life Crisis Center. And I want to welcome you to Life Crisis Today. Mental health is all over the news anymore, and people struggle a lot. And we also are starting to pay attention to our children and their mental health. And what is normal for a child? What's normal development? What is not normal? When do they need help? What does it look like? Does it look like ADHD? Does it look like there's been trauma? There's so many questions that so many people have. So we're going to talk about that and talk about children's mental health. And with me today is Samantha Kenny, and she is a child therapist for the Life Crisis Center. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah. Mental health. I know that's what you do. And we do a very specific thing. We work with the trauma of abuse. But we want to talk about general mental health to normalize what is normal and what is maybe may need some help. So I'm not even really sure where to start. What are your thoughts, just to start off?
Well, first of all, just to say that I think it's a really important topic, especially for parents and caregivers, because there's a lot of pressure on parents today. There's a lot of information out there on social media, a lot of comparison, a lot of mom blogs, like this is how you should be parenting, this is how your children should be behaving. And so I think that can create a lot of anxiety in caregivers to know what's normal and what's not.
Right.
And so I think it's a really important topic because there is a lot of variation to normal. And it is really helpful and empowering to know what are the signs that maybe your child is struggling or has a challenge that needs some extra support.
Yeah. And there are developmental things that happen too.
Absolutely, yeah. There's anybody who has a child knows that there are certain milestones at well checks, like growth or words. These are really measurable, concrete things to measure cognition and physical milestones. But what a lot of people don't know is that there are actually social and emotional milestones in development too. And so as our children are growing physically, they're also growing socially and emotionally. And we can kind of step back and look at those phases of development and look at what they're learning, what skill they're building in that phase, what that can look like, and what are maybe some of the red flags that there's a concern here.
Right. And there are phases and there's stages.
Yes.
What are some of them?
So across the whole lifespan, there are stages and phases from infancy until the older years. But for our conversation today, I think it would be helpful to focus in on childhood and adolescence. So starting with the toddler years, and then preschool years, and then there's early childhood school age years, and then adolescence.
Right. Oh my gosh. And we always think of the toddlers, the terrible twos, trying threes, horrible fours, but then we also get into middle school and high school, and there can be challenges all across the board.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think in my experience, a lot of times parents struggle the most with adolescence.
Yes.
And it can be a really trying and difficult, but important time of growth.
Totally. So why don't we start at the beginning? Let's start with toddlers. Okay. What is normal?
Well, this is one of the phases where there's a lot of variation in what's normal. There's a lot of development that's happening. It's said to be about 80% of development that happens in the brain up to age 2, and then it slows down a lot. And that's a lot of complex stuff that's developing, but it's rapid growth and development that's happening in toddlerhood. And there's so many things that are going on, but if we're talking about socially and emotionally, this is a really critical period for attachment and building trust, trusting that you can generally depend on other people to meet your needs, and trusting that the world is generally a safe place.
Right.
And that is really dependent on their relationship with their primary caregiver, that attachment figure.
So how can a parent help during this?
So knowing first like what the child is developing, and then knowing how to support that. A really big key piece of this attachment and trust is this idea of something called co-regulation. And that's the idea of regulating together. So when a baby is born, their stress response systems are fully developed, but that ability to calm themselves and regulate isn't developed until about 18 months. And then it's still growing, but that system isn't even developed. And so they're really dependent on that primary attachment figure, that caregiver, to regulate them for them.
Right, to soothe them and calm them and get them back into cooing and being fun and smiling and giggling and all that.
Yeah, you said all the things that we do, like as parents, like if our child is hurt or upset or crying, we pick them up, we hold them, we might pat them, rock them. soft face, warm voice, and soothing with them. And that calms them down physiologically. Their body calms down. They start to sync up with the caregiver's heart rate and breath. But if the parent or caregiver is not regulated, then that's where things can go awry. So if a caregiver responds with anger or frustration or anxiety and their heart is racing, and the baby or the toddler is not learning how to physiologically calm down and regulate.
Right.
So it's also really important in a way that you can support your child is for you to take care of yourself.
Oh, totally.
And to take care of your own mental
Yeah.
health and
Yeah.
being able to regulate yourself so you can help your child learn to internalize that and eventually be able to self-regulate
Yeah.
as well.
As a parent, it's really difficult when a child's like having a tantrum to not escalate my voice and get angry and upset. But if I just keep that totally calm, almost monotone voice, amazing how the tantrum will just start to go away.
Yes. Yeah, and I like that because the goal isn't perfection here. Like, parents are people,
Right.
and we have emotions too, and that's good to model to our kids that it's okay to have emotions.
Yeah.
But to be able to, for the most part, be able to respond in that way when we're in control of our emotions and we have that soft voice, the soft eyes, and so that they can soothe themselves. There are going to be times where you're preoccupied, you can't get to your child. You know, the child wakes up from a nap in the crib and they're crying, and you're in the shower, so you can't get to them right away.
Right.
Or you might be frustrated or anxious yourself. But the goal is to be most of the time to be in a state of self-regulation. And of course, in those times that we're talking about, I'm not talking about being abusive or neglectful.
Right.
But it's okay to be anxious or to get frustrated some of the time.
Right. It also helps to model how to do it. Like if I am frustrated, I'm modeling to my child, okay, I'm frustrated, but I'm handling it. I'm doing something about it.
Absolutely. It could be a good opportunity even to model how to apologize well. Right? Like if we lose our temper and we can come back and say, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to raise my voice at you, I was angry, it's not okay, I'll work on it. And that helps them to see like it's okay and it's good to apologize and we can apologize.
But then they're working on it, that they see us working on it.
Right.
Then it's not just an empty apology.
Right.
Right. So, okay, toddlers, what would be, how to describe it? Outside of the norm, things that are not typical development.
Yeah, this was a little bit harder in the toddler years to see because, again, there's so much variation in what's normal. And sometimes you can have a toddler who maybe cries a lot, but a lot of times they grow out of that. And it could be something like acid reflux or colic, or they have pain but they can't express it, so they're not sleeping well or they're crying a lot. A lot of times it's when we have a child maybe in therapy later on, we can look back to the toddler years and see that there was inconsolable crying or sleep pattern problems or something there. But just because your child cries a lot or has a hard time sleeping does not guarantee that they're going to have emotional or behavioral problems later on. But anything like inconsolable crying, that can kind of indicate maybe later on down the road there might be an issue.
Some struggles.
Yeah. And I think it's important here too to note that like all kids are different.
Definitely.
And they can be born with different temperaments and dispositions. And we tend to favor the easygoing, flexible kind of children that respond well to routine and rules. But then you might have a kid who's a little more independent, emotionally reactive.
High energy.
High energy.
Yes.
Yeah, these are the kids that are probably getting in trouble a lot at school. They have more negative responses from adults. But with every disposition and personality type, there are strengths and challenges. And those children, if they're given a safe environment to learn how to overcome the challenges and kind of play up the strengths, they can be really energetic leader types, right? There's a lot of really good that can come out of that personality type as well. But it's when the environment kind of is supportive and encouraging and engaging for the child.
Yeah. All right, so the next stage, that's this, we have the toddlers preschools.
Preschool, yes. So in preschool, they're getting more language, but it's still an emerging skill. Communication is still an emerging skill. Insight kind of into what's going on inside their minds is still an emerging skill.
They may have basic words, but they don't have all the nuances.
Right. So they can say, I'm mad, I'm scared, I'm happy, I'm sad, but they might not know words like I'm feeling disappointed or lonely or those kind of more nuanced emotional words. Yeah. And so as caregivers, we want to encourage helping them to be able to name and identify how they're feeling, to build that emotional vocabulary, because you have to know what you're feeling to know what to do to feel better.
Yeah.
And so you can say to your child, it looks like you're feeling
whatever,
right?
Yeah.
if they get mad in Target because they didn't get the toy that they wanted, it looks like you're mad because you're disappointed you didn't get the toy that you wanted.
Yeah. And I think for preschoolers, emotions feel really big.
Yes.
And trying to like know that that it's normal to have feelings. And anger is just as a big a feeling as being super excited over something.
Right.
And one's not bad and one's not good. They're just emotions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they feel it. It's very much more like a experience, like a felt experience as they get older and they start to have more of this kind of like intellectual awareness of their emotions. And they can say like, oh, I'm feeling really disappointed and I'm going to go do something and, you know, to feel better. Or get their mind off of it, distract themselves. But no, for a child that young, you're right, it's very felt. And so the emotions are can be really strong, really big.
Right.
And that can be difficult for caregivers because, you know, it's a lot of like temper tantrums
Yes.
and those kinds of things.
Yes. And how to stay calm as a parent
Right.
can be very challenging.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So for the preschoolers, let's go to the not typical stuff again.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Again, there's a lot of variation, but we might see things that they're not really like growing out of, you know, from toddler years. So still in preschool, some kids are still struggling with having the temper tantrums. They say it's the terrible twos, but you know, 3 and 4, they're still having those issues with regulating their emotions. They're going to act out their emotions, and so these are really normal things. If you see, you know your child, right? And so if you see that your child is really struggling and it's impacting their ability to function, like to have play with their friends or in school because they're starting preschool, then this might be a sign that they're having some extra trouble and need some extra support.
Right. And guidance.
Yes.
And maybe even suggestions on how to handle something. Whereas as a parent, you start stepping back a little bit because the kids get the experience and they understand, but then they still, a child who's struggling may need that extra help, may need you still telling them words they are experiencing.
Right.
Yeah, and how to get along with somebody else or whatever.
Like we were talking about, trust is really important for developing that in the toddler years and the preschool years. They're learning this idea of initiative and doing things for themselves. So this is why they become very independent all of a sudden. They want to do everything.
I do.
Yes. They want to do everything for themselves.
Yes.
And it's good to encourage that and be patient with them and allow them to do that. But you're right, we also need to be there for them and kind of sometimes step in and help them understand, like, there are some things that you can do to feel better. So you're feeling mad and disappointed that you didn't get the toy, but there are things that you can do to feel better. And it's your choice, you know, do you want to stay mad because that doesn't feel very good, right?
Right.
Or you can choose to do something to feel better, to calm down. And it's okay sometimes if you say that to your child, sometimes they will say, I want to stay mad because of that control and that initiative. Right. But it gives them the control. And then eventually, they're not going to stay mad forever. Eventually they come around and it plants that seed. There are things you can do to feel better, right? And so they're just starting to learn this idea. One, they're starting to learn how they're feeling, but also there's this idea that there are things you can do to manage those emotions. You can control those emotions.
Yeah. I remember saying, well, let me know when you want to do something different, and we can talk about that then.
Yeah.
Yeah. So give them that idea. It's their choice.
Right.
Right. Anything that is more atypical again for them?
I would say anything excessive. Separation anxiety can be normal during this time, but if it's excessive, if they aren't, you know, if at the beginning of the school year there's difficulty separating from their caregiver to go to school, this is normal.
Yes, it is.
But we would hope that eventually when they kind of warm up, they get comfortable to the environment, they feel safe there, they realize it's okay, mom or dad is always going to come back.
Mom. Okay.
Right, yes. But if your child doesn't and continues to have separation issues, then that might be kind of an indicator that there's some more anxiety there.
Right.
And then again, kind of in the future, kind of looking at it. I would say at this time, preschool years, it's a good kind of like watch and wait time too, unless it's really extreme.
Right.
And maybe if they need some like play therapy or something like that to help them with really strong emotions. But knowing and kind of keeping an eye on those kinds of things like extreme temper tantrums or the separation anxiety that doesn't seem to improve as they get comfortable or kind of get older.
Right. So we're ready to move on to school aged.
Sure.
Yeah. Tell me about them.
Okay. Yeah, this is a phase where learning and competence is really important. And so school is going to be an important part of their lives. They're building up this sense of competency over their environment. They're learning new skills and being able to encourage that.
It's fun to see their confidence go up.
Yes.
Because they've got skills now, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is a period of time where social relationships are starting to become more important, not as much as we'll see in adolescence,
Right.
but this is something that is important for them to be able to have and maintain friendships. Kind of getting ahead, if we're talking about things to look out for, this can also be a time where bullying starts. And so that's something to be on the lookout for in elementary and into middle school years. A lot of times kids won't tell teachers or parents how bad bullying is. So it's important to be able to have an open conversation with your children and kind of be on the lookout for any signs that they're avoidant of school or any changes in mood and behavior.
Right.
But a way to help with that is to have open communication with your child, and this is actually a really good time to start the foundations of open conversation because it's going to become so important in adolescence when they are going to be more resistant to that.
Yes.
But if you start when the problems are smaller, maybe it's issues of just like what's going on in elementary school and that kind of stuff. But having that conversation, asking your kid about their day, asking what's going on at school, kind of being involved in their life and responding in a way that's not emotional or judgmental, so that they start to see that they can share things with you, and that feels good to share things with you, and that you're a safe person to share those things with, so that as they get older and the problems get bigger, the consequences or, safety concerns, these kinds of things, they know that they can come to their caregiver and talk about it and not be afraid of how they're going to react or respond.
Any challenges for the parents in doing all that? Because you just gave me some skills that the parents can be there for the child, but thinking about the preschoolers and toddlers, we said, oh my gosh, just to be calm can be very challenging. But how about for the school-age children? Any challenges for the parents that they need to watch for themselves?
For themselves?
To help.
I mean, any time in parenting, right? We need to be aware of ourselves because it's frustrating.
Yes. Yes.
But yeah, in those conversations, like I said, being non-judgmental and non-reactive, because kids are going to pay attention to how you react to what they tell you. And so a lot of times they'll start off, if there is something that they need to tell you, they'll start off with a little piece of information and see how you react.
Right.
And if you get anxious or you get angry, then they're going to
or you brush
take it back in. Yes. And they're not going to share more with you. So being really aware of how you're reacting and responding in your own emotional responses to them is going to be really important during this time as well.
Times learning how to keep a poker face.
Yes.
So that you can sit there and listen so that non-judgmental stuff doesn't come out.
Right.
And then you can think of, okay, what does my child need in this situation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it would be good to have social support for that too, right? Like if your child is sharing some stuff with you and you've got to be a safe container for that, but then you might need, some extra support, someone to lean on to navigate through that as well.
Is there things with the school-age children that they, when they go to the challenges for them, what would that be like that's not normal stuff?
Yeah, this would be probably the stage where it's going to be more evident if your child is struggling.
Right.
They're going to have more insight, they're going to be able to communicate more, and so whereas before it could be maybe it's just there's something that they're going to grow out of, they're still working on this skill. By now you should see that there's some pretty decent emotional regulation skills going on. They're still going to get angry sometimes. They're going to have anxious. But if you see anything again that's like your child, if it's a sudden change where you have a child who is bubbly and outgoing and happy and energetic and suddenly they seem withdrawn, it's important to note that social withdrawal is not normal during this stage. In adolescence, we'll get to that later, but withdrawal can be kind of normal. But if your child is suddenly withdrawn or maybe some anxiety, some nightmares that weren't there before, those are indicators that they may be struggling with anxiety or depression that might be kind of starting out because they're still young, but you can see the early signs that they may need a little extra support.
I'm also thinking that the child that was real calm and then all of a sudden is like snippy and irritated easily, and the big changes like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, or calm and suddenly is like hyperactive, because anxiety can look like hyperactivity. And especially if we're talking about maybe like the younger kids in younger elementary school, we can see this where somebody might say, well, I think he has ADHD, but it's really anxiety because of that like buzzing energy. And it can look like being unsettled or not being able to sit still, or as a distraction for what's really going on inside. So just paying attention to your child's cues, and your child, if there's a change in mood and behavior, that's usually an indicator.
I think that's on all the stages.
Yes.
Like there's big changes. Like, wait a minute, this isn't my child. What's going on?
Absolutely.
Right, yeah. All right, if you're talking about adolescents, oh my gosh, they're so challenging, but they can be fun.
Yeah.
So let's talk about them.
Yeah, it can be a tumultuous time. Dr. Dan Siegel calls it the storm of adolescence because it is, hormones are fluctuating, so emotions are fluctuating. There's like teenage angst and lots of changes where before the social connection and influence was with the family primarily.
Right.
Now it seems almost suddenly they're pulling away from the family and their relationships. Their friendships are going to take the forefront of what's important here. And so this can be almost, I found, kind of jarring for parents too, where they feel really close to their child and then adolescence comes.
What? Where's my child?
Right. Who is this person that came and replaced my child? But all of those things that are going on are actually really important for the development, the burst of development that's going to happen. And if you can ride out that storm together, keep your child safe and maintain those connections and that relationship that you have, on the other side of that storm, ideally you have a fully formed, well-adjusted, resilient adult, right? But they need to go through all of these changes in adolescence to make that crossover from childhood to adult and really figure out who they are, because that's kind of as we're talking about, like the skill or the goal of that phase of development, it's identity in adolescence. And I think parents this can resonate with them, is that their child is trying to figure out who they are.
Right.
And they might try on a lot of different identities to do that.
Yeah.
And that can be challenging because sometimes those identities don't line up with the caregiver's values, right? And it might be the way that they dress, the music that they listen to, the friends they hang around, or it could be the big issues like religion or politics, because they're also becoming really socially aware.
Right.
So sometimes that can be hard for caregivers to see their child trying out these identities that they might not necessarily align with.
Yeah. Wait a minute, I didn't teach you that. Why are you thinking that way? Yeah.
Right.
Or why are you saying that way?
And it's important because they're differentiating from their family.
Right.
Like they're kind of separating, but it's to create their own sense of self and identity. And that doesn't mean that they're going to step away from their family and never come back. They have to try out these new things to make it kind of their own and their own values. And I think it actually could be really helpful for caregivers to know and understand that a lot of times these kids will end up reaffirming family values, or they're at least influenced by them, right? As long as you can ride that out, not have any kind of like major splits in your relationship with them, allowing them to be able to safely try out different identities and independence, setting some boundaries around it. But they usually do end up kind of reaffirming or at least being influenced by their family's values. And sometimes the identities that they try in high school end up being like who they are.
Yes.
So just kind of as a caveat to parents, I would say stay away from saying it's just a phase, or you'll grow out of it, or you'll understand when you're older.
Oh, kids hate when that's said to them.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And it may be true, right?
Yes.
It could absolutely be true that this phase that you're into, I don't know, heavy metal rock music you're going to move through it, or whatever it might be. But in that moment, to that adolescent, that is who they are.
Yes.
And so they perceive that statement as a rejection of who they are. And that can make them pull away.
Right.
And so being supportive, I love you no matter what, those kinds of things.
I don't understand you right now, but I love you anyway.
Yes.
Yeah. And you said two things. One is bursts of development, and that is so true. And if we can, like, storms don't just rain, 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 rain. Usually a storm is bursts of things, and so getting through those different things, are they looking into who they are, their music and interests and hobbies and things like that, or are they going to the politics side? Are they looking at their faith? What are they doing? Who am I as a person?
Right.
just doing everything that they're looking at. Can be a roller coaster ride.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as you say that, it makes me think of, as a parent, watching my own children before they would have a physical growth spurt. They might get a little moody, a little grumpy, some sleep problems, right? Like there is usually a little tumultuous time before there's like this like sudden burst of growth or maturity.
Right.
And that is kind of what's going on. It's like this storm, this tumultuous time, and then there's a sudden burst in what we see as like adult thinking and maturity that happens in the 20s, in the mid and later 20s.
Yeah. And the other thing is people who question what they believe, and I find they're the ones that are much stronger as to what they do believe.
Yeah, it really becomes their own.
Yes.
Right? Instead of borrowing the values of their caregivers or their family, they're really owning their own values.
Right,
yeah.
Right. All right, adolescence, a lot of things can show up.
Yes. So in adolescence, like I said, you have fluctuating hormones, which means fluctuating emotions. So there can be like irritability, anxiety. I mean, it can cause all kinds of things kind of going up and down. But there are some things to look out for that it's kind of outside the normal teenage angst.
Right.
Like I said before, social withdrawal in the earlier phase, not normal. In this phase, it can look like social withdrawal because they might suddenly want to stay in their room all the time on their phone, where they used to be out in the family room or, coming to dinner at the dinner table. Now they may be resistant to that. They just want to be in their rooms. And that can be normal, because they may want to be in there sleeping or talking to their friends, which in adolescence, the sleep schedule is different. Like it's stay up late, sleep in longer. And so they may come home from school exhausted and want to take a nap.
Right.
It doesn't mean they're depressed and they want to sleep all of the time. They might want to hang out in their room and like be away from everybody and have their own space and talk to their friends on their phone. And that doesn't mean that they're socially withdrawing. Right? It's just that differentiation and that space and the room and my personal space is very important in adolescence.
Yes. So you get out of my room.
Right. Yeah. And privacy, all of those things. But if you see something like that is extreme, so they're sleeping all of the time, there's a loss of interest in things that used to be enjoyable to them. They're not just like not wanting to come to family dinner, but they're withdrawing maybe even from their friends or completely disconnecting from the family.
The loners that really don't have any interaction with others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These are signs of depression.
Okay.
And so they are things to look out for. So knowing that like a little bit of emotional ups and downs and that kind of stuff is a normal part of adolescence. That they'll generally work through. But if it falls outside of that and it becomes something where it's like affecting their functioning, affecting their social relationships, if they're engaging in high-risk behaviors, drugs and alcohol, peer influence, all of these things are really important. And this is where creating that safe environment and setting boundaries is really important, like allowing them to test identity, but to a point, right? Like still, in some ways, they talk and think a little bit like adults, but in other ways, they still are very much like children.
Yes.
Yeah, and so that burst of development is really things that in the mid to late 20s that's happening is like impulse control, cause and effect, planning for the future. So this is why we see teenagers being reckless or thinking that they're invincible, that they can be in these risky situations, but nothing bad would ever happen to them.
Right, they don't think of the consequences of it.
Right, and so if you can imagine that this is a brain, and this is the front of the brain. This is like right here. This is the last part to develop there with all of the impulse control and all of that. And sometimes with teenagers, it's like, boop, it's not there. It's not online.
Okay.
And so as parents, we have to come along and set the boundary with them.
Right.
Like, no, you can't stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning because we know you're going to be tired and it's going to affect you. You got school in the morning. You can't do that, right? So coming along and setting those boundaries with them when appropriate, so that as they become adults, they internalize those boundaries as well.
Because there are consequences if you can't go to work.
Right.
Yeah, as an adult, yeah. So with helping people all the way from toddlers on up, getting the support that people need. You mentioned it earlier that a parent needs to have outside support as well as so they can then support their child. Is there anything else for the parents to get that outside support, or where would they get? I know peer support, having a friend going through the same stages as I am, that type of thing is helpful.
I would suggest that they might start with talking to the primary care provider, because that's someone with an established relationship that, when you go in for a visit, you can say, my child is exhibiting these symptoms, and they might be able to reassure you too, because they have some knowledge and awareness of mental health, to say, oh, these are typical behaviors, or they might say, yeah, let's do a referral and maybe do something like some therapy for a younger kid, play therapy, or maybe some school-based therapy, or even in the office doing some therapy, and they would be able to connect parents to local providers. Or if a parent wanted to, there's 211, the resource hotline that they can call, and they can get the names and numbers of resources in their area for their child.
Any other resources you can think of? Because they're the two I always think of.
I would start there, because then they would be able to give you specific names and numbers for providers in the area.
I know most people think, because I've had friends tell me, you talked to your doctor about that when it was like social and emotional development. I'm like, well, yeah, that's part of the development of my child.
Right.
Because most people think of the doctor as physical health.
Right.
But the doctors are trained in a lot of different things.
Yeah.
So starting there is a really good resource.
Yeah, and they're actually, primary care doctors are doing great with asking the questions about anxiety and depression, especially as they get older, but even when they're younger, asking those social emotional questions to be on the lookout for anything that might be a concern. Yeah.
Well, we've gone over a lot of information. How we get to talking, we forget something. Is there anything that we've forgotten that you want to talk about?
I think we covered it for today.
Okay.
I feel like we covered a lot.
Well, great. Well, thank you. Thanks for being a part of this.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
Yeah. And I want to thank you for joining us. There's a lot of information about children and their development, and is this normal, is this not normal, how do I get help? The Life Crisis Center has a lot of resources. We do have a hotline, and that number is 410-749-HELP. Again, that number is 410-749-4357. We already mentioned 211. 211 is information and referral. It's for the state of Maryland, and Life Crisis is a part of that as well. We are also part of the National Suicide Hotline, and that number is 988. So please don't struggle if you feel like you're suicidal, you know somebody that's suicidal, we can get the resources and the help that you need. We also have a website, and that is www.lifecrisiscenter.org. We also have a few other programs. We talked about that we work with issues of abuse. That's one of the main things we do, whether it be child abuse or domestic violence or sexual assault or rape. But we also have human trafficking. We have a program for that. And we also have the CASA program, which is a court-appointed special advocate to help with in the child abuse and through the foster care system. So please don't struggle. We probably have a resource that can help you. I also want to thank PAC 14 for helping to make this show available.